Hello, welcome to episode 9. On this show, Meghan Kemp-Gee reads a section from After Beowulf by Nicole Markotic.
It's one of the most wonderful things about this text. It's deeply funny how she's always punning on things like erecting the hall and stuff like that.
And Aaron Tucker talks with film critic Alicia Fletcher about the contemporary Western and what it has to do with his new novel, Soldiers, Hunters, Not Cowboys.
This was his first kind of baddie turn, and it's a big one.
I grew up in the interior BC around cowboys and ranch land and things like that. So the cowboy has always been sort of like a figure of interest for me.
Welcome to Poets Corner, where Coach House poets read their favorite poems from other Coach House poets. This episode, Meghan Kemp-Gee, the author of The Animal in the Room, reads a section from Nicole Markotic's modern retelling of Beowulf. Meghan, welcome to the Coach House podcast, Poetry Corner. Who are you? Introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Meghan Kemp-Gee. I have a new book out called The Animal in the Room, which is poems all about animals, but also animals that aren't really animals, and things like that.
And who are you going to be reading for us today?
I am reading an excerpt from Nicole Markotic's book, After Beowulf.
Okay. Take it away, Meghan.
Okay.
That first Beowulf falls, as the parade of suns surges, each one begatting a son, a son, a son, sometimes one queen. Yes, next, King Bee Hrothgar so keenly milks the cow by the throat. Hail Hrothgar, war prince and war mighty, hall builder. Yes, yes. Storybook hubris, a hero's greatest hits playlist. He built his fortress, Heorot, heart house, to build, to command men, to hew stone, to haul over roots and up hills, to sand and whittle, to erect the keep, to decorate the great hall, a pretty great hall, with boar heads and embroidered banners and nouns sculpted into timber. Hrothgar then raises his Heorot, a home wrapped around the brawling hall, cuddling the take-me-to-your-leader throne room, court of ruler wanglings and coleslaw manglings. Oh, anticipate, anticipate. Heorot, my Heorot, where, yes, 'tis I, reader, authorial me. I hear, and my eye spies, vast wall weavings and full frontal stag runes, oft-painted shields, cross-stitch samplers. Oh, and surplus rings, surfeit torques, and needlepoint runners, warp and weft. The towers palisade and bedeck this glut of rising gables. Heorot, foreknowing and forewaiting. Heorot, Hrothgar's stone promise, a palace of words, the pacing of words. Heorot, whole, gabled, trumpeted, right up until its sturdy beams slip into inflamed prophecy, the approaching domed doom. No, not that monster, just blistering family blood. Selling daughters won't save that fabled Galleria. Heorot, the Dane's heart, mounting its own mythology of present-day tremblings, cloudberry seeds ground into the rafters, its future smeared with gray ash, now end on the bloodiest lust.
Amazing. What a fantastic reading, Megan. That was incredible. When you told me you were going to read an excerpt from After Beowulf, I was surprised. I myself would have a hard time reading this section aloud, and not just because of the Old English scattered in there. That was a very impressive, excellent reading.
Thank you so much. Well, I love the book, and I really love that passage, so I was excited to read it.
Can you tell us, start off by telling us why you picked that passage?
Oh, well, I mean, this I thought was one of my favorite Coach House books that's come out recently, and I hope to maybe, just shine a light on it a little more. I love the original poem, and I love teaching it, actually, to undergraduates, and I thought this was such an exciting adaptation. It actually made me laugh quite a few times when I was reading it. I think it's really clever and really playful. And one of my favorite things about it is how it really captures the original poem's weird moments of looking forward and looking backwards, like in this passage, what's called prophecy. The idea that everything that happens is interwoven with past and present and future. That sort of moment where you can say a name and it kind of explodes outwards into meaning. That's what I like.
Before we go on, I should say that this is After Beowulf it's not a translation of Beowulf at all. It is what Nicole calls a retelling of Beowulf, right? So this language is very modernized, and whenever I've had to describe it, I describe it as if you're at a party and you've never heard of Beowulf before, and the funniest person at that party, Jen, just tells you what Beowulf is front to back.
Yeah, I think that's really good, like a retelling. And I think that's my impression of how Beowulf is supposed to be told, like at a party, sort of a show off, look what I can do moment. And I think the book captures that spirit really perfectly. And I would love to teach this book and read it with my students in the future as well. I think they would love it too.
I think I've never read the original book, or not the original poem certainly, but a translation, even a full translation before this. And what struck me about it, I was aware of the story, but I didn't realize how much of it is a party. Like it happens in a beer hall, right? There's a lot of drinking and cavorting and things like that happening in here. And I feel like one of the things I found the funniest about this book is how Nicole leans into this bro-ishness, right? Did you notice that? Did you have some favorite parts or?
Yeah, I think that bro-ishness, and also the ability of the poet as she or he or they is speaking to sort of comment on it or raise an eyebrow about it. It's one of the most wonderful things about this text. Like, it's deeply funny how she's always punning on things like erecting the hall and stuff like that. But again, I not to take away from the genius of this poet, which is very real, but I think that is also a perceptive reading of the original, where the poet is often nodding at their own mediation, I guess. The poet tells a story of this happening in Hrothgar's hall, and often mentions that there's also a poet there spinning tales. And I think it's this interesting moment of telling a story, not necessarily about a poet like oneself, but kind of looking forward and backward and saying that situation is a lot like what I'm doing here. And this moment of the I and the I that she puns on in the passage that I read, I think is a great moment like that, saying the poet is a I as in the pronoun capital I, but the poet is also an I, looking back, looking forward, playing those games.
Yeah. I was curious because your book, The Animal in the Room, is not very old-timey at all. There's not a lot of, I would not get the Beowulf influence in it there. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about, do you find a Beowulf and that style, epic poetry, influential on you at all? Or how does it play sort of into your own writing then?
I think it plays into my own writing just because I've really enjoyed studying some Old English literature, because I think knowing about the origins of the language you write in is important. I really enjoy writing explicitly about etymology in my writing, actually, thinking about the origins of words. It is something that I thought about a lot when I was writing Animal in the Room, because I was using so much evolution metaphors in that book. So I read a lot about evolution, how it works, genetics, that kind of thing. And it really actually does remind me of languages. The same way that species evolve and change over time, and species have these strange analogous anatomy in common for reasons that are often so arbitrary and wonderful and counterintuitive. Languages are the same. I was having speaking of dead languages, I was having a great conversation the other day about the word bear, and I bring that up because I don't know if this is entirely accurate, and I don't want the linguists to come after me, but someone was saying that Beowulf, if it in fact does mean Beowulf, that's a euphemism for bear. Maybe, again, don't come for me, linguists, but euphemisms for bear are fascinating because it turns out a lot of European languages, our word for bear are often euphemisms. So linguists have this theory that it was like a taboo to speak of bears at one point in Proto-Indo-European history, just because our languages seem to be designed around avoiding saying the word of the animal. And I love that Beowulf is kind of intertwined with that. Yeah.
Just to wrap up here, Megan, and then thank you again for appearing here. I was wondering about the language that, as someone who teaches Beowulf, and so we're talking here. Sorry about that. There are Nicole still keeps a lot of old-timey English in here, Old English. What was the word that she repeats so often in this? Hierot.
That's actually a great word, and it is connected to my book, The Animal in the Room. Hierot is the Old English word for heart, actually. And as is punned on in this passage, heart meaning the organ in your chest, it is a homonym for heart, H-A-R-T, which is an old word for deer. And poets have been punning on that connection maybe since before the original Beowulf poem was written. But this idea that there's this community center that is also a heart, meaning the heart in your chest, but it's also connected in some weird way to deer. That is also what my book is kind of about, and I'm kind of leaning into what poets have been interested in as deer as metaphor for, I guess, several thousand years now.
Megan, we began this podcast, and I had no idea how you were going to relate this retelling of an Old English poem back to your very modern, fun, quirky book of poetry of sad animals. But we've done it. Thank you, Megan, for appearing on the Coach House podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
This June, we published Soldiers, Hunters, Not Cowboys, the new novel from Aaron Tucker that takes a hard look at toxic masculinity and the Hollywood Western. Central to the book is the 1956 John Wayne movie The Searchers, a classic film with deeply problematic content. We asked critic and producer Alicia Fletcher to talk with Aaron about the significance of The Searchers and how it helped inspire his new novel. Aaron Tucker, Alicia Fletcher, welcome to the Coach House Books podcast.
Hello.
Hello.
Aaron, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Aaron Tucker. I'm a poet and novelist. My previous novel, Why, Oppenheimer, Horseman of Los Alamos, was published with Coach House and is a sort of literary biography of Robert Oppenheimer. I also do work in facial recognition technologies and how they gatekeep access to citizenship resources. And my second novel, which we're going to be talking about, is Soldiers, Hunters, Not Cowboys. And I'm really looking forward to talking with Alicia.
Alicia, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Alicia Fletcher. I'm a film historian, programmer, curator, film critic, visual researcher, general gal around the city of Toronto when it comes to film. And I'm very excited about Erin's book. And I've never actually spoken about The Searchers before, which feels almost impossible at this point. So it's a nice milestone.
Well, I wanted to put you in conversation with each other because, Alicia, because you're an all about town gal for film in Toronto, and Erin's book is about both Toronto and film, and specifically The Searchers, like you said. So before we begin, Erin, just for our audience, briefly, maybe can you talk about why The Searchers is significant to soldiers, hunters, not cowboys?
Absolutely. So the book is split into two halves. The first half of the book is a conversation between two ex-lovers and is centered around largely the woman's description of the searchers and how it interweaves with her relationship with her father. And then it starts to mirror the unnamed man who is the protagonist, his relationship, I think, to masculinity, aggrieved white masculinity. This conversation sort of escalates and the first half of the book ends. When the second half of the book picks up, it's told mainly through that protagonist's perspective. There's been an unnamed airborne catastrophic event in downtown Toronto, and he's trying to make his way across the city to this woman whose name is Melanie. And The Searchers then starts to map itself onto his journey across Toronto from St. Jamestown kind of westward. I was really interested in The Searchers. I read a fairly substantial biography of John Wayne, I think not quite at random, but it was like in the free little library, and I picked it up and I began kind of being interested in it and revisited The Searchers at a time when the Trump presidency was ascendant, if not kind of ingrained. And when I started to look at commentary about The Searchers, it kind of fell into two camps. Like, film critics kind of recognized that Ethan is a racist, that this is a film about kind of American racism and how it's interwoven in. And then you had other commentators like right-wing websites like Breitbart kind of championing the movie as, you know, Ethan Edwards, the main character, is a martyr and he kind of represents the best parts of America. And so I was interested in this transition in particular in reception of the movie and how that again reflected this sort of idea of aggrieved masculinity. What does somebody like John Wayne mean in the contemporary moment? What does something like The Searchers mean in the contemporary moment?
For me, The Searchers was very important in learning film history. And you know, I'm not that old. And Erin, I think you and I are like spot on the same age, but I'm old enough that the way The Searchers was taught to me would be very different than anyone could ethically teach it today, 15 years ago. And it's the meaning of that film has changed so much. I'm just kind of curious. I mean, you talked about the John Wayne biography, but did you experience this film as a child? Was it something that your parents watched? Like, what is your first memory of this film?
Yeah, so I don't really have a first memory of it. Like, I do remember watching it, I believe, in undergrad, but I don't really have much of a memory of it. It wasn't until as an adult I came back to it. And again, it was sort of pinned to this biography and my interest in revisiting the Western, and that particular form of white male sort of energy and projection. I grew up in the interior of BC around cowboys and ranch land and things like that. So the cowboy has always been sort of like a figure of interest for me. And then when I started to think about, after watching the movie, how mean the movie is and how mean Ethan Edwards is, he's desecrating corpses and he's not hunting for Debbie, the person who's been kidnapped, to save her. He's hunting Debbie so he can kill her. Yeah. And he's like a murderous, hates all Indigenous people kind of with a blanket hatred. And it was an interesting sort of thing when I returned to it to look at it, especially in comparison to John Wayne, who at the time was this enormously bankable, lovable movie star.
Very lovable. Yeah, he had never played a character like this, like a villain, which I don't think I was fully aware of until doing research, that this was his first kind of baddie turn, and it's a big one.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like, how were you taught The Searchers?
I think there was definitely a nod towards Indigenous representation and the amount of brown face that's in this movie, or red face. But overall, it really was from the angle of, this is film technique at its greatest. And I think it doesn't matter what your relationship to The Searchers is, and there's a lot of people who don't like this film. That opening shot is pure cinema. It's a shot that children, not even knowing what The Searchers is, would recognize. And it's one of those, top 3 or 4 iconic shots in film. And it doesn't matter even what my thoughts are about the film. Watching it again, this last round for this podcast, my heart just swells seeing that scene. And so I think the background that I have with the film was really coming at it from Technicolor, VistaVision, how John Ford, unlike really any other filmmaker, especially at this point in the mid-50s, just kind of breaks the frame of film, breaks the canvas. He's so painterly. He's filmed in Monument Valley prior to The Searchers, but I mean, this is the moment where Monument Valley is a star. And so as much as I think the film for me has a lot of problems, it really was canonical like 15, 20 years ago when I was doing like Film History 101. I think that image, which we're talking about the image of the door opening and the porch, Martha. And it's, so beautifully framed. I mean, that reproduces in a film textbook so well. And I think that's why it gets used on so many covers and in every sort of, film book. It just was treated as capital A art. And it's only kind of later, watching a documentary like Real Engine, which I would recommend everyone watch, where you get the kind of other side of it. Because yes, of course, John Ford is very upfront with this is a horrible man, but it's almost like we didn't get it for generations. Like I think reviewers were shocked by this role for John Wayne, but people were still rooting for him, which I know is a major part of your book.
Yeah, and it is interesting because I didn't really read any of the criticism or scholarship because neither of the characters were film scholars or critics. So I was kind of trying to react to the film as the film and as I was watching and things. But as I've now that the book's out, I've been going back and reading, and the reception of the film in the moment was, it made money, but it wasn't nominated really for any awards. And it wasn't until like the 1970s, and there's one scholar, I think it's Eckstein, who edited this really interesting collection, kind of pins the rise of the Searchers to the establishment of like film studies in programs in the university, and figures like Spielberg, Scorsese, Cimino, Schrader. Yes. Who,
big
like
time.
Not just Taxi Driver, but like hardcore, where you have these kind of like men going into the belly of the beast and looking and kind of coming out of it changed for it, right? And the film finally, I think, started to be taken seriously almost in reaction to those influential directors reclaiming it in a way.
I think you're spot on. I mean, it really was New Hollywood, who would have been 12 or 13. Like I was watching an interview with Scorsese talking about seeing this for the first time at 13 years old. He had just graduated 8th grade, and he and his friends snuck into the theater to watch this, and what it meant to them, and how shocking it was to see their hero shoot, an Indigenous person's corpse and say things like, so that they can't go on in the afterlife. Like just horrible, shocking racism. But you're spot on. There's a lot of people that had huge problems with this film, including, I was really surprised to read about how much Francois Truffaut hates this movie. I see where the angles they're coming from, because its pacing is so strange. Like when you watch it, it's a roller coaster ride. There's these comic sequences in this otherwise brutal film. It talks about rape in a way that most films in the 1950s did not. It's incredibly graphic, and then these kind of slapstick moments with these very broad comedy.
Can I interject for a second? I have actually a question. I'm a bit of a layman to all this as a non-film person, but I wonder, do you think Ford knew how brutal this movie was? Or was the idea of him just shooting an Indigenous body, desecrating a corpse, sort of like, well, whatever at the time,
It's interesting. I think, we have the benefit of many, many audio interviews, written interviews. I mean, Ford would talk to anyone. If you've seen Spielberg's Fabelmans, David Lynch
yeah.
plays him in a cameo, and he entertains this like 18-year-old kid, and which is Spielberg, and talks to him about all his movies. So we have so much Ford on Ford. And so it's hard to tell because he's very revisionist, and hindsight is 2020. So if you dig down to what was he doing in 1956, I honestly don't know. Later on, he claims that, of course, that was incredibly intentional, and he was looking at the Eisenhower era and, the emergence. This is kind of pre-civil rights, but it's getting there. He's looking at those things, but I don't know how cognizant he is. I think it's almost like he's making a silent film like vaudeville, where he's got the kind of villain that would tie someone to the tracks, and he translates that into this character of Ethan, but it's hugely successful.
Yeah. I'm reading a little bit more about the film too. You do start to learn how that Ford, I think, so he and, I'm trying to remember the screenplay. Oh, Frank Nugent. Yeah. So he did the shooting script. So it's right after Brown versus the Board of Education, basically, like literally months after that they start writing the script. And then when you look at the difference between Nugent's shooting script and what ends up in the film, Ford adds the scene where Wayne's character, Ethan Edwards, scalps Scar. That wasn't in Nugent's shooting script. So he actually adds further violence to the Indigenous character as a way of kind of like underlining it. Right. And even the iconic shot at the end of the film was not in the shooting script. Nugent's shooting script had him like coming in carrying Debbie, and he kind of like gets accepted into the home. And Ford kind of says no, he doesn't get to enter the threshold, and you get, just as iconic I think as the opening, you get that the end of him like walking out into the desert, and however you read that, he is sort of cast out into the desert. But I do think he thought he was making an anti-racist movie, or at least he was trying to, with the maybe the limits of what he could do. But it gets so muddled with, like, Mart ends up marrying an Indigenous woman, and then like it's played for this like the broadest comedy ever, and like there's moments like that where it's just like, no, like this,
hard nose,
yeah. I was hoping you both could speak to the legacy of the character of Ethan. Aaron, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was listening to a really interesting podcast about Harrison Ford, because Indiana Jones is coming out, and the way they were talking, the big picture, the way they were talking about Harrison Ford sort of reminded me of how Wayne often was and existed, and as this kind of like relic, but also man that could just punch people in the face as a way of solving problems, and we would cheer, and Harrison Ford was a carpenter, and Wayne started as a stuntman and doing all this stuff. Like there's something about him coming up as a non-actor, teaching himself really how to act. You read interviews with him, and he talks about making the John Wayne character, because it's not his real name, it's Marion Morrison, and how much of a construct it is. And so I think that idea of like making yourself into that figure lives really well in this moment. And the idea of performance, and that kind of performance of masculinity and aggrieved white masculinity is very present in the contemporary moment.
Yeah, he would definitely, if alive today, be wearing a MAGA hat, I would assume. But that self-made, man kind of myth is so important. But he was someone that my grandfather really idolized, and in a problematic way. And I think that legacy is so interesting. But the character of Ethan crops up in cinema recurrently, and people are still kind of grappling with him. There's a lot of filmmakers who still kind of use that archetype and then twist it. And I think that that's really the sign of, a film that's transcended any category, whether it's genre or, time period, to just become something that's in our consciousness. And The Searchers is that. I mean, I would also say one of the best twists on The Searchers is Zacharias Canucks, Indigenous Inuit film. Beautiful. You can see it online, where it's 2.5 hours. I think it's quite long, but he takes that Searchers story and makes it his own. And it's a beautiful, beautiful film. And that's from just a couple of years ago, maybe 2017 or something like that.
Yeah. And that film, like the way that John Ford Searchers uses Monument Valley, that film is really striking because you get like long extended shots of the Arctic that are just as beautiful and incredible. And instead of horses, you get like dog sled teams. And you get to watch them kind of work those, like you see the cowboys work the horses. That film is like really visually beautiful and such an interesting kind of like remapping of this movie.
That just is more to our point that this is a very, singular film, that there are very few comparisons to be made.
Aaron Tucker, Alicia Fletcher, thank you for coming on the Coach House.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks, Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. Please come back. We promise not to wait too long this time.